Hey everyone, welcome to the Final Girls Berlin Brain Binge. We're really excited to have Dr. Katrin Seyler with us today to give her talk on librarians in horror and the gatekeepers of knowledge. Um, Dr. Katrin Seyler morphed from a trained historian into a librarian during the 2010s and has always enjoyed digging through the archives for dusty and bizarre things. Her fondness for horror was born out of an illicit viewing of Hellraiser sometime in the early 90s. I'm going to show you my shirt right now.
Oh, excellent. Like I'm got Evil Dead, which is my second favorite, but like Hellraiser is brilliant.
It's seminal. Okay, she has been lucky enough to see many beautiful libraries around the world from the inside, but much to everyone's disappointment, has yet to find a secret room hidden behind a bookshelf. There's no podcast, no blog, no novel yet. Just a bit of fun, and don't we all need more of that? I agree. The floor is yours. We'll be back afterwards for a Q&A.
Okay. I think Sarah, you just forgot to say to donate to Final Girls Festival. So I'm gonna do that on your behalf because
Thank you.
I think it's such a wonderful thing to have and such a like warm and welcoming space. So do click the link if you can spare some money or some future attention to the festival. There's a Patreon, I think, as well, where you can get sweet little female-led horror shorts once in a while. So do support them if you can. Yes, hello from me to you. The purpose of this is really, as Sarah just said, to have a bit of fun, is recuperation from life in general, and a bit of good old escapism, and to kind of revel in the library aesthetic, which I think some of you might be into. I think I've heard from Ellie that this talk is going to attract a particular audience. I have a feeling that you're kindred spirits and you're probably the best audience as well. Yeah, the aesthetic is basically going to be chaotic academia, because that's pretty much my personality at this point. And yeah, the librarian. Why the librarian? I am one, just accidentally, but it's really, they do keep cropping up in horror movies and libraries as well. They always end up in the library. So I was wondering about that and whether we can dive into that a little bit today. And it turns out that the librarian is kind of a pretty political character in the horror genre as well, because all sorts of gender, race, and class politics are played out in that character. Yeah, so that's pretty much the only coherent argument of this talk. We're doing movie club today, essentially. It's not going to be overly academic. We're going to start off strong on the academia, and then we're just going to go into like watching movie clips and me waffling gently in between. Good. As you can see, the font purists need to be strong today. Yeah, let's move away from this and into actually, I put this there because I expected I had to do something technical at this point and set something up, but that's all working. So you can just enjoy, which I think is really the most beautiful bookshelf on this planet. This is from a monastic library in Bavaria, not too far from me. I kind of had grand designs that I would deliver this talk from there, but like the nuns were like, you want to do what? And I was like, yeah, okay, let's not. And they don't have Wi-Fi anyway. So, but there's lots of lovely places, libraries around here. And I actually found an academic paper which was written in 2001 by Radford and Radford, which is called The Library, Librarians, and the Discourse of Fear. And that was published in the Library Quarterly, which is a University of Chicago press journal. And in that, they looked at representations of libraries and the stereotype in popular culture generally. So they used one Stephen King short story, but it's mostly stuff like Seinfeld and Sophie's Choice and Umberto Eco's Name of the Rose, the film with Sean Connery, where the monks get murdered in the library. And they sort of try to figure out why these stereotypes keep happening in popular culture. And they started talking about Michel Foucault. So this is the only bit that's a bit painful. And for the ones of you that were spared so far by Michel Foucault, he's a philosopher, French philosopher of the previous century, who wrote a lot about incarceration, about social control, about how we organize knowledge, and about madness and sex, because he's kind of a well-adjusted kind of guy. Um, and he's also a blood relative of Fester Adams. Like, I know that one of them is fictional, but you just can't persuade me otherwise, because, I mean, look at it, it's uncanny. So the authors in this paper kind of recognize that the library is a place of fear, specifically referring to the library and the name of the rose, because there's like poisonings and murder happening there. So lots of anxieties floating around. But they say that the library is a place of fear because it's embedded in an underlying discourse of fear. And this fear isn't just like fear of like the boogeyman or the dark or clowns or whatever. So not just anything, but it's the fear of discourse breaking down. And discourse in this context means basically text, speech, ideas, concepts that you use, like it's a set of these things that you use to make meaning of everything, of your life, of your world. And this discourse is controlled, not least by places like libraries, because they kind of filter and select and maintain. But it also contains other kinds of discourses, and they become problematic when they sort of start pushing in to yours and encroaching on yours, and making your meaning break down because they're not compatible. So the fear that they're talking about, in my opinion, is really about losing a grip on your reality, because the things that mean something to you are at peril from these other meanings that keep pushing in. And this is something really that's happening in the genre. That's what the horror genre is about. It's about this fear of losing grip on your reality, on your sanity, because there's usually an entity coming in the face of which reason and logic and all of that just collapses. So I think, considering that the library is a space of fear of this discourse collapsing, it's not surprising that it keeps resurfacing in the horror genre. Okay, so the library is about like a potential breakdown of reality and thereby creates unease and tension. It's also at the threshold between order and chaos. So there's always these dualities, sanity and insanity, and life and death as well, because there's always something kind of alive in the library, because ideas live on by people and civilizations that are long gone. And this is, I swear, this is why there's always ghosts in the library. And the authors sort of talk about this as well and describe the library as sepulchral, as a tomb or a temple. So it has to do with death and the sacred as well. And this is a quote from this paper: libraries are understood through metaphors of control, tombs, labyrinths, morgues, dust, ghosts, silence, and humiliation. And I want you to just hold on to these themes. I mean, you're probably recognizing them if you've been watching horror movies, but just hold on to them while we go through these different clips, because they're definitely recognizable. So this is just a picture of New York Public Library, which I think at this point should have its own IMDb page, because it's constantly in films, and for a reason, because it's lovely. But you already get the sense that this space is like kind of awe-inspiring. It's kind of a temple. It's also quite airy and quite breezy and light, because obviously you're trying to read in there. And libraries tend to be, even though you don't want direct sunlight on books because that makes them deteriorate, so sometimes it's a bit twilighty, but it's generally not very dark. And I want you to pay attention to the illumination of the spaces in the clips that we're going to look at, because you'll find that it's more veering towards the nocturnal side. It's kind of turning into noir in horror. And if you also want to pay attention to what the librarians that are depicted wear, because that's kind of a giveaway of their status as well. Yeah, we're gonna this talk, compared to yesterday, it's not as gender focused on like patriarchy and the like as the other talks were, but we're gonna sort of pitching the girls against the boys and see how they measure up. And also disclaimer that all of the films are pretty mainstream. There's a couple of like genre treasures that have been hidden away, but mostly they're mainstream and they're Western as well. And this is probably because of me, because of my selection, because like Asian horror, I just can't watch because either it absolutely terrifies me or it makes me sad. But I also have the suspicion that this is because knowledge is encoded in a particular way in the Western world, with its own hierarchies, and it's usually erudite, it's scholarly. It also overlaps with the patriarchy, but this is what the library represents, this specifically encoded knowledge. And that's an undercurrent in the films as well. Yeah. The witch, we heard about witches yesterday, that kind of has a different type, just as a contrast. They have a different type of knowledge which is encoded differently. That's more situated with the body. It's accessed through intuition. It's sort of quite feminine. It has to do with healing. Like people accused of being witches were often healers historically. And it's kind of nature-based, so it's coded differently than this sort of erudite, scholarly, civilized type of knowledge that may or may not be more sort of masculine in representation, at least. Okay, so there's just another lovely place, which is the National Art Library in London. So if you're anywhere in the UK and you ever wander into the V&A museum, then that's located in there. So they're just another example of them being sort of quite grandiose, kind of almost sacred sort of feeling spaces. But let's meet our, let's meet our first librarian. I'm sure a lot of you have encountered Alice before, so enjoy. So Alice already in a car, pretty buttoned up. The glasses are missing, but you know, serving the stereotype. Okay, so already one of the most iconic films of the 80s starts off in the library, and if you think back to how the description went from the paper, it's already a labyrinth. Like she totally gets lost in between the bookshelves and stuff, and you've got ghosts already, like these anxieties are already sort of bubbling up without even being obvious. Let's see, and then this follows on, so there's like the little song, and then the Ghostbusters show up at the library and interview Alice, and I just wanted this to be like a little bit of a sort of fun opener, and let's just see how this goes.
Legs, but it definitely had arms because it reached out for me.
Arms? I can't wait to get a look at this thing.
Alice, I'm going to ask you a couple of standard questions, okay? Have you or any member of your family ever been diagnosed schizophrenic, mentally incompetent?
My uncle thought he was Saint Jerome.
I'd call that a big yes. Are you habitually using drugs, stimulants, alcohol?
No.
No, just asking. Are you, Alice, menstruating right now?
What has that got to do with it?
Back off, man. I'm a scientist.
Great.
I mean, that really annoyed me because I've watched that like 12 times in my life at least, and I've never clocked that. And I was like, okay, it is the 80s, and that sort of period joke is probably funny back then, like 40 years ago. But it's just like, it's already, they're not doing her any favors. They're presenting her in this like stereotypical way. I think the actress is about mid-50s when this was filmed, but it's like the typical like old sort of shriveled up pruny little woman in a sort of high cut blouse, and then making fun kind of at like her mental health, and they're asking about her menstruating, which like kudos to the library director going like, what's that got anything to do with it? But these are like supposed to be people who like believe in ghosts, so they should be asking her about that. But yeah, it's not going well for the female librarian so far. But
Legs, but it definitely had.
hold on. Okay, let's have a look at It. Stephen King's It from 1990, which was directed by Tommy Lee Wallace, who did a lot of sort of secret horror films like Halloween 3, which is excellent. Has nothing to do with Mike Myers, but I recommend. He did episodes of Twilight Zone, Fright Night 2, and the like. And this is the mini-series from the 90s, not the infernal remake of recent years. For the ones that don't know, I'll give you a little sort of synopsis of these things. So Ancient Evil terrorizes a bunch of kids in small town Maine in the 60s, and it takes on the shape of their worst fears, mostly as a clown. And then they defeat it, they sort of band together and make it go away, but it comes back 30 years later and have to take on. And the remake is just awful because it just misses the point thoroughly on just everything that this film and the book that it's based on is about. It's kind of about loss of innocence, maturing and showing fortitude in the face of your fears, and it kind of doesn't really do that in the remake. And it does the character of Mike Hanlon, who's the Derry town librarian in the book and in the original, very dirty. And there's a bunch of blog posts that I have written about that. I'm going to put them in the chat afterwards so you can read about that. But basically in the original, Mike is kind of the, he describes himself as the lighthouse keeper. So he remains in Maine. He gets punished by this curse as well because the others go off and they forget all about it and they become rich and famous. And he sort of remains and stays poor and lonely, but he's got awareness and he remembers. And when he comes back, he calls the others back. And in the book, he's very much involved from the get-go in like Derry town history because his dad is kind of an unofficial local historian. He keeps track of things. He keeps records and pictures and things like that about the quite racist past of Derry, and some horrible things happen there. Like Stephen King does that very well in the book. And all of this is basically taken away in the remake. So they erase the character's depth, his whole intellectual side, his soft side, and that's all gone. I think he's even a junkie in the remake, and a lot of people have found that offensive. I mean, it's just generally pretty shit as well as a movie, but it's been lamented in some of these blogs that Mike Hanlon is kind of a role model for young black men who might consider a career in librarianship. And it's sort of, yeah, something that completely goes away. So I think that Mike Hanlon, but other male librarians in horror and in popular culture are really important role models because they're kind of sensitive, they're nuanced, and they're still courageous, but in a not a macho way. So they're kind of feminine but masculine as well, in the way that they kind of radiate like a gentle strength. And Mike's definitely courageous because at one point, like they defeat the monster with silver earrings because they kind of get it in their heads that works like against werewolves and stuff. And he goes back on his own as an adult to retrieve them. So he goes into the monster's lair and gives them the weapon. So he doesn't have electoral weapons like making them remember, but also the actual weapon that they use against the monster again. So let's have a look at a little clip where one of the characters, Bill Denborough, who's turned into a famous writer, he's kind of Stephen King's alter ego, comes back to Derry and tries to find Mike in the Derry pub. Okay, so in this, he basically, in the beginning, he walks into this like display of his own books that his friend has kind of lovingly curated, even though he's pretty much forgotten his friend. So what Mike does is he's sort of nurturing, he preserves the friendship, not just the memory, but like the friendship as well. And he's also sort of quite poised in the face of like that his life hasn't gone as well as everyone else's. But he's got quite a powerful position because he's in the book and in the film, he's sort of the narrator as well. And he's an observer and he keeps preparing. So he's also a keeper of the past because he's kept Bill's bike. That's his childhood bike, Silver, that he sort of found. And yeah, it's meant to be kind of by some kind of guiding force, but he takes care of it and keeps it. And he's kind of a keeper of the past. And horror is a lot about your connection to the past, and you always have to kind of figure out the past and remember it and make it right sometimes so that ghosts can move on and things like that. Even in stuff like Freddy Krueger, you need to figure out the backstory and why this is happening. So Mike, as the librarian, is in touch with this past of Derry, but also their past, and he's holding on to that and preserving it and nurturing it as well. So the library itself is kind of pretty normal looking in this and sort of a daytime thing, not very fancy. And it's sort of, you'd think it's a safe space, but it gets breached. There we go. Okay, so this is another member of the Lucky Seven coming to find Mike as well, who's obviously gone off with Bill to do stuff and look at the bike and things. But he's got a different encounter with Pennywise the clown in the library. This is pretty close to the book, actually. The scene is described like that. It's a different character, and the sense of nostalgia is played up a lot more in the book because it's kind of childhood memories that come out and then kind of conflate with a present day reality that then sort of shatters because this monstrous entity comes in. So this kind of relates directly to this argument from the beginning that the library is a place where kind of reality is slipping away from you, and this is happening, and it's only happening to him in this scene, which why I think it's pretty terrifying, because he's kind of trying to retain some kind of comportment and like kind of keep it together. He's telling himself keep it together while there's like blood that only he can see, and the librarian is kind of trying to be nice to him, but he's just losing it and leaves. But this is sort of one of these scenes where I think it's kind of illustrated how it does relate to this sort of breach of like sanity. Sanity is compromised even in a perceived safe space like the library. Prince Albert in a can is a tobacco, by the way. I didn't get that joke either, but they're like verbatim from the book, which is also why the remake's better because it's much closer to the actual book. And then there's we're moving on from this. Actually, yeah, there's another scene which is kind of in the library at night, and then again there's pages flying. I'm going to skip over this because I want to move on to the next one, but it's just sort of in the same vein of like you're safe nowhere, you're not even safe in a space that's sort of quiet, calm, controlled. Yeah, there we go. But we're going to have a look at an example where, sorry, this one, okay, let's stay on this one, where the library isn't a frightening space but kind of a safe haven. And you can argue with me whether this is a horror film or not. I don't really care, because like there's religiously motivated serial killings and this film is kind of soul destroying, so I think it would qualify as a horror. David Fincher's Seven from 1995. Again, we're back in the New York Public Library. the premise of the film is that there's a demented serial killer plagues New York, and two detectives investigate. Detective Somerset is played by Morgan Freeman, and he's sort of the seasoned investigator who's a week away from retirement. Obviously, he doesn't want the case. He knows that it's going to be horrible, but then there's like this young rookie cop that's played by Brad Pitt who's got obvious impulse control issues, and he takes on the case. And the background of these murders are the 7 deadly sins. So he does some research, and we get a montage of research. That's nothing new. If you want one from the Barber Institute Library, there's a Birmingham, UK, Birmingham based werewolf film called Lycanthropy, which is on YouTube. There's my old sort of library is in that, where they do this kind of montage, but this is done specially and differently. It's going to be a 5-minute clip, but I'm going to make you watch this because it's just so exquisite.
Thanks, Dollar. How you doing? Two things to look up. Okay, get away you'd like. How's everybody? Hey, Smiley. Come on, George. The call's getting cold. Duty call. Gentlemen, I'll never understand. All these books, a world of knowledge at your fingertips. What do? You can play poker all night.
Hey, we got culture.
Yeah, we got culture coming out our ass.
All right. How's this for culture?
Smiley, you really gonna miss us.
I just might.
Okay, so this is such an exquisite piece of filmmaking, because this film is absolutely relentless and it's an onslaught in any which way. The city is, New York is just bleak and horrible, the case as well, and this is like the only time you get respite from this. So it presents the library as a refuge. It elevates the detectives and the viewer's understanding. The score is absolutely sublime. Bach, it's Bach on a G string, Orchestral Suite 3, in case anyone cares. And it's just a safe space because it has this sense of intimacy. There's this like clandestine little society that are the night guards and Detective Somerset, and he's let in after hours. So it's notable that it's nocturnal and that it's non-white people as well. I think one of the guards is a sort of a dubious ethnicity to me. I can't really work it out. They're all male, but they're all sort of working class, apart from Detective Somerset. And there's just this sense of like intimacy and transcendence in this space of learning, this nocturnal space, because the detective starts to see beyond events and you by extension as well. And he gets the psychological complexity behind this. There's an element of art as well, through the music, through the illustrations, through the books. It gives you a lot of information. It's kind of unsettling, but it's all heightened in a way that doesn't happen anywhere else in the film. And Detective Somerset really he's not a librarian, but he's kind of a stand-in librarian. He's the gatekeeper of knowledge. He's also very together. He's impeccably dressed. And he kind of sort of a little bit set apart through education from the night guards. He's kind of a bit snooty as well, but they sort of clap back at him and they're like, how's this for culture? Sort of, we've shown you. And it kind of transports you out of your kind of ordinary, tragic world, the color palette, especially because New York is kind of gray and muddy colors. It's all very drab, very monochrome, and this is monochrome too, but it's kind of richer. The colors are more saturated, and it's all sublimated. And you know, where else could that happen but the library? So the evil that's inherent in this case is kind of present. It's kind of this kind of satanic undertone of the sort of the netherworlds of Dante and so on, but it's sublimated through culture and through learning and kept at bay through the library. Okay, just trying to get to the next slide. Hold on, let me just get out. Okay, right, okay. Now from very sublime stuff to like absolute gutter trash. Chainsaw Sally, directed by Jimmy Burrell, and his daughter plays Sally, who's a Porterville town librarian. This might be one of the things ever, but like certainly this year. The tagline is "Season of the Bitch," so like right away, just vomit-inducing shit. And Sally turns into a chainsaw-wielding maniac at night who punishes people for random offenses that they've committed against her or the community. It's kind of indiscriminate. They get murdered in a variety of different ways, not necessarily involving a chainsaw, but sort of that's the weapon of choice. They also get eaten by her and her brother. This whole thing tries to be kind of cultish and kind of like John Waters meets Harmony Korine, but it kind of misses the boat on that. It doesn't have the wit or the social commentary or even the shock value or any of the charm of either of them. So it's just pretty terrible. Yeah, I'm gonna make you watch some of this because I had to. So in this clip, Sally punishes someone for not returning a library book.
Tina, there you are. I've been looking for you. Waiting and waiting. You never came back. Why, Tina?
Why? I don't know what you're talking about.
Don't pretend you don't know.
Please. I have no idea what you're house.
No idea. No idea! Is it not true that in June of last year you checked out a book from the public library? Is it not true that you, Tina Gray, checked out Acting for Life by the late Robert C. Atkins? And is it not true that since then that book has not been able to be checked out by any other patron of the Porterville Public Library? Is it?
Yes, I guess so.
And why is that, Tina?
Why, Tina? Because I never brought it back.
That's right. You never did. And now your fine is in the double digits. But Tina, you only live 4 blocks away. I sent notices. I sent letters. What the fuck is wrong with you, girl? And now there's a bunch of fucking fat asses waddling around Porterville. And it's all thanks to your complete and utter lack of responsibility!
Okay, I mean, it's just so bad, but like I was kind of holding on to some hope that this would turn into like at least some kind of feminist revenge fantasy that has some kind of a reason for existing. They are kind of switching up the killer trope because it's not like the girl in the skimpy skirt running away from the chainsaw killer. It's kind of reversed, but it's just awful because the only reason that she's a librarian is to kind of exploit the contrast between this buttoned up, meek, mousy, librarian. So to kind of just heighten the contrast and show that she's kind of a crazed, oversexed kind of mental splatter queen, and make that kind of interesting through this contrast. I mean, she's wearing all these kind of grey, boxy things in the day, but then also this, like I thought this might be kind of empowering in some way, but I didn't crop any of these. This is just a shot of her ass, like quite lingering in the film, girl. This is preceded by a scene in a nightclub where there's a lot of kind of lesbian making out stuff, which is just like male gaze serving, and there is no relationship with knowledge, not like with Detective Somerset and Mike Hanlon as we've seen before. It just doesn't exist. It's just about the stereotype and this kind of fetishization of the librarian. So especially this dichotomy in the female librarian, where they're like either kind of the pruny little lady, but if she's young and like buttoned up, there's some kind of simmering sexuality underneath that's just waiting to be unleashed. It's just horrible. So it doesn't really subvert anything. It's just there we go. This is kind of the stereotype that I was talking about. The dude on the left is from a calendar that a bunch of male librarians did called Man of the Stacks. I mean, it's a cute picture and it's sexy and everything, but it's kind of in the same ballpark. Like, I don't know if they're doing us any favors. I mean, they're doing me a favor because I like looking at that, but like it's kind of, part of this kind of stereotype that they're not taking away. And this film is just incredibly sexist. It serves up a really heinous soup of stereotype, and it just doesn't do anything for like female librarians at all. Like the male librarians so far, they're doing much better in terms of being nuanced and well-rounded characters and so on. I don't know if I'm gonna bother with this clip. It's just basically the chainsaw is incredibly phallic. I'll play it, but every direction, this film. It has no redeemable qualities. So I'm sorry for showing you this, but I had to suffer through this. Let's have a palate cleanser. Let's have something much more sophisticated. Tale of a Vampire from 1992. This is the only female directed film that I have as well, by Shimako Sato, who's, I think, London trained, but Japanese by extraction. And this is kind of almost an art house film to me. It's very much geared towards the female gaze. There's Julian Sands plays a vampire in this. Julian Sands is an incredibly sensual type, and this portrayal is as well. I think she did that deliberately, that she cast him for this. And there's a very strong contrast between Anne, who plays the sort of library assistant in this, who the vampire meets, and then sort of projects his past desires for his past love onto, which is problematic in its own way, but I'll get to that. But generally, this is set in a made-up library, which is an occult archive in London. Vampire Alex is doing his research there. And it's kind of this sort of literary inspired revenge fantasy, this film. It's kind of based on Edgar Allan Poe, and it features Anne, who's we see here. I'm just going to show you this. This is the trailer for it. The film is in full on YouTube. It's very hard to find anywhere else, which is why the screenshots are blurry, and I apologize for that. But I just wanted to show you the clip so you can hear her voice, because she's very different from how you imagine the stereotype to be, and from like Chainsaw Sally as well.
Feeds, nurtures him. To kill is the greatest sensual delight he knows. We call such beings vampires.
I don't believe a word you're saying. You scared me.
Will you come for coffee with me?
About you, do you have some?
I did, a long time ago.
You've used your magic again. You said that once before, a long time ago. Makes you sound like an old man.
Are you in love with her?
I don't think that's any of your business.
I love you. He will destroy you.
I want to be with you.
We made a vow.
Why me? Because I look like her.
He will devour you. That is what the vampire calls love.
So you can already tell that Anne, the librarian, she starts at this library. She's not very invested in her role as a librarian, and she does say that she just needed a job, which is very relatable. But she's also already set up as being offish, taciturn, but defying the stereotype. She is very conservatively dressed throughout, and it doesn't really play with this tension of like revealing that or bringing anything else out of her. She actually, in the trailer, when he asks her if she wants to go for coffee, she's like, no, I want to go home, I need a nap. It's like, yeah, I mean, a very relatable character. And she's not very easily seduced by the vampire. She's not under his spell. It's kind of out of her own volition that she pursues him, and he's like, oh, you shouldn't do this because it's going to end badly, which, spoiler alert, it does. But she sort of wants this, and it's very much placing emphasis on her agency, and his kind of sensuality is very nerdy looking and weird. But the men in this film do all the sensual stuff. Like there's a lot of shoots where there's sort of his neck extended, there's blood dripping down, there's a lot of licking and watching and sort of sucking and things like that, and that's all the men, whereas she's sort of quite cerebral, and she's very, so I just need to get out. Okay, there we go. So this is Anne just meeting her fellow librarian, Denise, who's named and treated very respectfully in this film as well, and sort of portrayed. They would pass the Bechdel test, more or less, because they kind of talk about the job and she's giving her an introduction. And it's pretty like realistic of what would happen. And they talk about sort of the patrons amongst the vampire Alex, but also sort of a Renfield kind of little inspired character who's being weird, and she sort of tells her what to watch out for. And they have quite a very pleasant sort of friendly relationship, which is nice. That's again, they're sort of often seen like working together in this library. Here we've got Alex just looking at in the library. It's also very sort of dim and dimly lit, kind of this gothic kind of feel to it. But what I think is interesting about her is that we don't find that much out about her character in the dialogue, but in the way her space is decorated. So this is her house, and she's already mentioned that she's very much interested in French poetry, and in the background, whoever designed this set did it so like lovingly. There's like French expressionist paintings, a Louvre poster, and there's sort of poetry books dotted around her, and it's very sort of rich color scheme as well. So we do see her as like a well-rounded individual. So she's not just conflated to her librarian role, but she's like an individual in her own right. This is in her kitchen where she's looking at pictures of her like friends and family. She's pretty isolated in the film, and her family are dead. She goes to see them in the cemetery. And there's a scene where she's sort of by their grave. So it's a film about sort of loss, very much, and it has these sort of literary themes. So this is her ending up, but I just wanted to include this, that she's well, she does get kind of sacrificed. Even then, she's not really portrayed as an object of desire. The film is very much about her being desired. Unfortunately, that's kind of the reason why she's there, because the vampire wants her, and that's her connection to the past. So her connection to the past is not through knowledge and knowing about the past, but being kind of the same as the vampire's past love. And this is sort of, again, sort of portraying her in terms of desire, which happens as well, sorry, just ignore this for a sec, with The Mummy, which is the one with Rachel Weisz, where sort of a mummy wakes up, this really terrible like Hollywood, but it's the same thing. Rachel Weisz plays a librarian who's kind of very cutesy and very like, oh, I'm so ditzy, but like I have secret knowledge about Egyptian gods that can help us, and she trashes her library as well. But she's kind of, it's exactly the same. She's sort of seen by the mummy Egyptian pharaoh that they've awoken as his like past bride, and she's desired in the same way. So this is, I think, very curious to note. I'm aware of the time, so we're gonna speed through the rest. I need about 5 more minutes if that's okay.
10 more minutes is fine too.
Cool, excellent, because I've got some, this is so much fun, this film. This is called The Church by Michele Soavi. This is a proper giallo produced by Dario Argento, 1989. I absolutely love this. Tagline is, "You haven't got a prayer." I mean, if you like cathedral-based horror, this is the film for you, absolutely. The narrative kind of goes absolutely off the rails. It's mental because they had 5 writers on it and they couldn't agree on an ending, so they ended it like somehow. It's a lame ending, but like it's so worth it because it's visually so exciting, this film. It's just mental imagery, so creative. It quotes from like everything, like Indiana Jones, all sorts of things. So incredible visuals, and it has a score by Goblin, who did Suspiria, the like la 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 la, which is supremely creepy when you listen to that in the dark. And here they're given organs, so it's like it's epic, and Keith Emerson is part of it as well, of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. So it's all prog rocky of the 80s. And the librarian we've got in this is Evan, who's on the right here. He's sort of reasonably hot guy librarian, comes to church to catalog books, unfortunately. So he doesn't in his librarian life either. Much more interested in like equally gorgeous conservator we see on the left. She works at the church and does up some murals, and they get it on as like two attractive consenting adults should. And then she finds a manuscript scrap, and then he gets a bit obsessed with it, starts doing stuff that he shouldn't do, rooting around the church. I'm going to show you this clip because it's just shows how cool this film really is. So this is their library, like it's kind of, again, kind of catacomb-like in the basement of this church where they're sort of examining this manuscript there. And then he goes snooping around and starts doing stuff. Okay, so he's kind of not really a gatekeeper of knowledge like the other librarians were, like the male ones anyway. But he's kind of the catalyst. He kind of snoops around because he's curious, and then things happen. He gets himself a touch possessed after that, and just all hell literally breaks loose. So he unleashes the demon, and he doesn't really fulfill this stereotype either of being kind of tweed-clad, sexless, but ventrally curious librarian. So the male librarian isn't necessarily kind of cultured and in control, which I mean, ultimately Giles and Somerset aren't either, and in this one he's not, because one of the priests eventually figures out what's going on. He can't stop it either. But I think he's quite an interesting one, because in this film there's kind of gender equality between him and the conservator, because they both know a bit of Latin, they know a bit of this, and they sort of complement each other. So it's kind of a departure from this stereotype, but he also has less depth as a character. He kind of disappears at some point, and which is this narrative that just unravels, and he shows up again, but there's like, it starts following other characters and it gets a bit weird. Okay. Then the one you've been waiting for. I mean, everybody that I've talked to about this was like, so when you say horror, is like Buffy part of this? And I was like, it can be. And Giles is kind of the father figure in this, who's sort of ties in with like Mike Hanlon sort of being quite a nurturing type. I'm not going to bother with the clip here, because I mean, you've probably all seen this, or some of it at least. And the library is kind of a safe place in this program as well. It's kind of where they go to regroup, where they try and figure things out. And by the same token, it's the portal to hell. Literally, it's like there's like the hell mouth in Sunnydale, in the town where they live, and then they slap the library on top of it. So again, it's this idea of threshold, where like these like sanity, insanity coexist. And they have resources there as well. So the library in horror is kind of a place where you get resources, because the weapons in horror aren't always physical, because you're not fighting something that's physical necessarily, but like something that's immune or disembodied or like conceptual, like you need something else. And you fight that with knowledge. So it's kind of the library is like a traditional domain of knowledge, and you could describe it as an intellectual armory, whereas the church kind of functions in a similar way as a spiritual armory. And the pairing of Buffy and Giles is obviously for like comic effect, because she's kind of sassy teenager, and he's sort of out of touch, like English kind of old-fashioned type. And in a way, he's the one who's in touch with this past again, with the old world. He kind of represents this. He's kind of hostile to technology as well, which wouldn't really compute nowadays. Like you can't do cubes and work anymore, but he's sort of a bit against that. But they complement each other. I think that's an interesting pairing, because Buffy kind of knows about stuff that goes on in the present. So he knows about stuff that's 100 of years old. He knows about demons and old books and stuff and what to look out for. But she's sort of invested with kind of what goes on currently, and sort of points out things. There's like a scene where they go to a nightclub, and he's sort of a bit condescending and lectures her about how she needs to be able to identify and sense the vampires. And she's like, yeah, that one. And he's like, what? And she's like, yeah, he's wearing a shirt that nobody would wear. And he's totally bamboozled by this like realization that she could just figure it out like that. So yeah, I think there's this element in the library in Sunnydale that transports you as well. So it transports you away from like this sort of bubble gummy poppy kind of California high school kind of drama into something that's a little bit removed from that and sort of more calm and regrouping. And Giles is there to nurture very much. So he nurtures the whole group. There we go. So he's kind of looking after them at one point or another. I think the actor, Anthony Heady, does a really superb job at that as well, because I think that's difficult to pull off, and not make it weird or creepy, or kind of patronizing. And he does it beautifully. And Giles, because this is a series, so they've got more time to sort of play with his character and develop it. He has like a sort of naughty side as well, where he sort of, I think he gets it on with like Buffy's mum or something like that, which again, father figure and father role. But I think he's sort of very much in keeping with the stereotype, without making that stuffy. I think they managed to update that quite well. Okay, and just one thing to end on. The Necronomicon is a film. Yeah, it's not great. It's kind of a sort of episodes, and there's a library segment which is like a wraparound segment about Lovecraft, the character, like the writer, but he's a character and there's coming to a library trying to find like the fabled Necronomicon, which doesn't exist. Like some people think it does, but it doesn't. It's fictional. And he sort of discovers it, and there's librarians there too, who look a bit like Egyptian priests and are quite weird, and they try and sort of this surveillance element as well of the librarian, like they're being authoritarian for a reason, because he tries to like nick the Necronomicon. And you could do a whole separate talk about books and horror because they're like animated and something bad happens. And again, this is about this idea of knowledge being kind of transgressive and transformative, and if you take it out, as in this case, into the world, it'll inflict damage, which is this idea of discourse again. But here the librarian is something that's not even male or female anymore. It's like an alien thing from another dimension. And like I feel like that a lot in my daily life. But they become monstrous at the end and sort of shed their humanity completely and turn into this. So this is just an example of where like gender just fails as well, and it's sort of the librarian becomes part of this kind of horror cosmos. Obviously he succeeds and takes the Necronomicon out, but here we are. Good, that's me done. So feel free to like give me your 2 cents. Maybe you know of other examples, maybe you have wildly like differing views, but oh wow, there's stuff in the chat. Sarah, do you want to give me
That
some?
was all me just sharing my random observations throughout the talk. So what's in the chat will not make sense out of context.
All right.
Yeah, anyway, but I thank you so much for that talk. It was extremely fun and fascinating, and also when it was meant to be, also very frustrating, right? Watching these female librarians be completely like decimated by the male gaze, just turned into parodies, turned into totally superficial plot devices.
Yeah, I mean that I found that yeah, it was frustrating watching that, and it never got better. It never got better. The only redeeming feature of that film was that it has Gunnar Hansen. So if you're like a diehard Leatherface fan, he plays her dad, I think, who gets killed. And yeah, I don't know how much money they gave him to be part of that absolute tribe, but here we are. I'm just going to put those links in the chat as well that I promised you.
That would be great.
So there's Black Girl Nerds talk about Mike Hanlon, but if you Google him, there's a lot of like vitriolic reactions to the remake for reasons. There we go. So that, because that was something that obviously resonated with other people, not just me.
Great, we'll definitely save those links and repost them later. So if anyone has any questions, please do forward them. I took a bunch of notes, but not very many questions. One thing that I found really fascinating was when you mentioned that in horror, it's so often necessary to like figure out the past, remember it, and then make it right so that ghosts can move on, or trapped spirits in some way can move on. And that's like, yeah, that's such an essential like part of horror that's actually very transgressive and kind of about healing, I think. And I had never thought about it as being often very located in a space like a library, and that these kinds of characters are like ushering that experience.
Yeah, it's kind of like forgotten knowledge. Like you always need a key of some kind, and this key is like in a book, in a document, in a manuscript, often, which again I think is a Western way of thinking about this, like how knowledge is preserved, because it isn't necessarily in a book, but I think in sort of popular imagination it is. And obviously I think it ties in with like an aesthetic where it's like, oh, this is cool, this is like sort of rifling around old paper and things. And I think that has some fascination generally, that you find something that's long forgotten and that can have an effect on the present as well. But yeah, it's like you operate almost in a different plane, and like the characters do. They need to get access and get that through the library. So it's kind of like a portal.
Yeah, absolutely. Like now that I'm tuned into that, I'm going to be thinking about this whenever I spot a library in a film and see how it's playing into the narrative. Ellie, do you have a question?
Yeah, we have a question here. How would you recommend moving? How did you move from being a historian to a librarian? So this is more of a life question.
Oh, a life question. I don't know. I applied for a job and then I sort of worked different positions and ended up in like scholarly communications. But yeah, just went for it, which is possible in the UK. I think if you have a scholarly background, though, there's a lot of roles where I mean, obviously you've got like searching down, you already know how to use the systems as a user, and that goes a long way, I think. I mean, obviously, if you wanted to be a cataloger, you need to, that's literally been described as the dark arts by a former boss of mine. So I don't know, it's really learning on the job a lot, and it evolves a lot. There's a lot of sort of new technology coming in, new systems, depending what sector you want to go in. Just be mindful that there's automation as well, where you sort of, I'm constantly learning in my post, and there's always projects and things that are sort of part of the international librarian community. Actually, Sarah, you asked me about that earlier. We did just have like a massive library convention in Germany a couple of days ago. That I had to go to and like do a talk. But I also said, like, be aware that you need to work with people and you need to work with technology. So it's not just like sitting in a little nice sort of dusty office and being surrounded by books all day. That's not real life, sadly. It'd be great.
We have another question that came in just now. How would you view the access to technology and web? How would you view that this affects the genre?
Yeah, I know. I think that fascination with like old stuff is not gonna go away. And I think that'll continue to feature, at least I hope, because it's part of this sort of dark noir type aesthetic that people find attractive. I fucking hate those films where it's like, oh, it's a murder on Skype, like there's a weird creepy killer like kind of going into your Skype calls. It's like I don't find, I mean, I'm old school as well, like I don't know, that they don't tickle me, but I don't know, it would be interesting to like see how a generation that's sort of more native to that, like what are they called, digital natives. Like I was born before the internet. I didn't have internet for the first like 15 years of my life or something. So, and then it was very slow and very different from now. So I kind of, I don't know if I have a different relationship with this personally. But yeah, I think, I don't know. I mean, did people, I wasn't sure whether to explain like what a card catalog is in the beginning, where the little cards fly out of the drawers. Like, I mean, the librarians are going to know what this is, but like, this is how you used to find books. You had to like look up alphabetically who the author is or who what the title is, and then find it. And I mean, that's all replaced by computers. And I think that does take away from this like fascination a little bit. But they are, I mean, sort of older, clunkier technology features. Like I was watching Stranger Things, and they were in a library and were looking up like newspaper articles on microfilm. So that's kind of part of it a little bit. But I think, like what I was saying at the end, is that the books are kind of animated. I think that just doesn't work with technology, because there's something where that's like, even like Harry Potter, where there's like the little fairy monster book that sort of goes under the bed and lives there, or the books that scream and stuff like that. It's just, I don't know if that works with.
It's interesting. I feel like the objecthood of the book and like the specificity of the place of the library is something that is so specific and so like it's so rooted in the analog and in the tactile as well, and like the librarian's knowledge is supposed to be such a specialized thing as well, like whereas with all of us becoming web savvy, it feels like a less specialized thing to have access to super specific arcane knowledge in a way.
Yeah, I wonder if it might even add to that, because you become more removed from it and it becomes less normal in a way.
Yeah. It becomes like a relic, like a place of
Mm.
the past. Sorry, that's just my giving you my train of thought as
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
Ellie, there's some more questions. Do you want to?
All right. Let's see. Okay. Lovecraft is one of the first things that come to mind for me with Librarian horror. Miskatonic University and its library's copy of the Necronomicon plays in a lot of the stories. Head librarian Armitage plays a protagonist in the Dunwich horror, keeping the dangerous book out of monstrous hands. Curious how often that sort of role appears in film. Are librarians more protecting ancient knowledge or hoarding and misusing it? More often oblivious about what knowledge is in their library, or secret keepers holding the power of that knowledge?
I think that's a great question. I think it's a double-edged sword, and it's both at the same time. It's this duality again, where I don't think they're ever oblivious of what's there, because you like wouldn't be by profession, I can say that. You just know what's there. And unless something like materializes out of nowhere because it's a portal or something, you would know what's there. But I think they're definitely doing both. That sort of, I don't think they're misusing it. I haven't seen any of them. I think maybe Evan from the church, but that's because he doesn't know what he's doing. He's sort of bumbling around and just like poking things he shouldn't be poking. But they're sort of goading him on, to be honest. Like there's a presence in that church that's sort of trying to like be released and stuff like that. But I think they're definitely sort of more a protector role, and trying to sometimes shield people from knowledge that is dangerous. But I don't think they misuse it as such.
It kind of ties into something I was thinking during your talk, which was kind of this idea of being courageous enough to actually have this knowledge or face this knowledge that can sometimes be very dark and dangerous. I don't know if you could talk about that a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, for Mike Hanlon, it's definitely a kind of a curse almost, because he sort of suffers from that. Like we've seen that he sort of lives in poor town because he never was rewarded for leaving. But I think that's kind of specific to like the It universe. But I think that sort of, I mean, it seems like they thrive on that because they're almost part of that old world. So I don't think they're actually finding it burdensome. It's kind of their like mission almost to do that. Like I didn't, in the representations I looked at, I didn't think that anybody's like deteriorating from having to bear this, but this is sort of their mission. This is what they have to do. And they're kind of aligned with that knowledge. They're not sort of suddenly being like bombarded by it, like the other characters that sort of seek help from the librarian. I do think that they meet their limits, like Giles in Buffy does meet his limits, and I think that's quite interesting to know. But I don't think that's because he sort of I think he gets kicked out of the library at one point and then has like an existential crisis about that. So the fact that he's away from this is kind of troubling him more than actually being part of that. Although he does like struggle. I think this is this universal thing of like the reluctant hero that doesn't really want the chore and the kind of the thing he has to do, but then eventually accepts it. So yeah, I think they embrace it. Librarians posted there as well. That's quite a nice thing. That's a list. I think there's some more films on there where I made a selection where I was like, okay, I want them to be quite prominent in the film and like almost be the protagonist, and not sort of a side character. But there's many more. There was like some contemporary ones, like what's it called, What We Hear and See, or something like that on Netflix. There was one which is quite feminist, and there's a library that features in that as well, where things are revealed that have not really anything to do with like ancient knowledge or anything, but yeah, it does feature. I've got, like, if there's nothing else currently, we're nearly at the end, but a book recommendation as well, Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury, which is a lovely Halloween read. I do think that there's what's the name? Rachel Bloom, the comedian, she's got a song that's called "Fuck Me, Ray Bradbury, You're the Greatest Writer in History," which I would say maybe hold off on that because he's a pretty awful misogynist. I mean, I didn't know him, I don't know about his life, but Fahrenheit, the novel that made him famous, was published in Playboy. And I haven't read all of his books, but I've read some, and the women are never done well in those. They're always like airheads, they're kind of gossip mongers. They have no part of like a life of the mind or anything, and they're sort of at worst, in worst case scenario, they're in cahoots with like fascism and fascist regimes. So it's, I don't know, maybe hold off on that, Rachel. Having said that, this is an excellent book. It's really Halloweeny and cool, and it's a kind of an inverted like coming of age tale, and there's lovely, like many are set in the library because one of the characters' fathers is like the custodian, like the janitor of the library. And there's amazing descriptions that tie into this like anxiety around death as well, which the book is about sort of aging and coming to terms with your age. And there's like descriptions like the library at 7:15, 7:30, 7:45 of a Sunday night, again like nocturnal, cloistered with great drifts of silence and transfixed avalanche of books poised like the cuneiform stones of eternity on shelves. So high the unseen snows of time fell all year there. And then it goes on, like one of the characters is like, the library, I'm even afraid of it now. All the books he thought perched there, hundreds of years old, peeling skin, leaning on each other like 10 million vultures. So this is really like tapping into this anxiety, like vultures being obviously waiting for you to die, and it's kind of being confronted with like ancient knowledge where you realize that you are gonna die, basically. So yeah, just another example where, and this is the book where I really started being like, okay, yeah, another one.
Have you read The Library of Babel by Borges, by Jorge Luis Borges?
Oh, ages ago, but not recently.
This is some kind of philosophical horror in a sense. I don't know if anyone else out there has read it. About a library that's infinite, and all of the knowledge in it is like apocryphal. Like everything is like you're searching for ages for something that you're not sure exists, and like it's like a deadly search, and people are falling off the banisters and dying to their death, and like searching for their entire lives.
This is funny because
I can recommend this story. I mean, it's a bit difficult, but it's great.
Yeah, Borges is hilarious. I had a student once when I was teaching who was afraid of going into the library. So I think it's just weird how this like provokes anxiety, and at the same time people like love it and feel safe there because it's kind of lots of old wood and old chairs and things like that, and quiet. But yeah, very ambivalent space for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. We're about out of time, but I just have one last detail that I wanted to ask a question about from the film, from your reading of the film Tale of a Vampire. And then later on, you were talking about also that film that Rachel Weisz was in, The Mummy, right? And that in both films, these female librarians are like objects of desire for supernatural beings, like a mummy or a vampire. But so I'm just curious as to why. Do you think that like, I mean, I guess, yeah, I know that Tale of Vampires is directed by a woman. I'm assuming The Mummy is not.
No, I don't think so.
I'm curious about like how do we escape this, or like is that necessarily disempowering? Is it yeah, like how does that factor into it? And did you find it troubling?
I don't know. I found it a bit disappointing that that's what happens. That's sort of her fate and what she succumbs to. Although it's her decision, so she made that kind of choice to go after him, even though she was warned. Like she was warned by the guy who ultimately kills her that it's not going to go well if she keeps going after the vampire, but she does anyway. So she does have a say in it. And she's not in that film, she's not presented as like an object of desire, which I found interesting. So there's none of that like usual, like, oh, please make me a vampire, like, the thing that they normally do, like in vampire movies. She doesn't really do that. So, but her past self kind of did. The past self is, it's not her past self, but like the character that resembles her in the past. And she's a lot more like flowing hair and billowy dresses and things like that. So that's her role, whereas Anne isn't like that at all. But yeah, I think it's almost like that has to happen for it to be acceptable.
I really
Like,
hope we have more exciting and, I mean, empowering feels like too basic of a term, but just like multi-dimensional female librarians portrayed in cinema to come.
yeah, that would be great.
Where can you find Tale of a Vampire? Is it actually?
It's on YouTube. Somebody kindly ripped it off a VHS, and it's there in full. Yeah, I mean, quality isn't amazing, but it can be watched there. Chainsaw Sally, well, that's kind of, if somebody wants the
Yeah, my
DVD, I've got it. I can have it on.
everything
Yeah,
you were
but
saying about Chainsaw Sally, I kept thinking if only this were like a queer feminist camp reappropriation of this story. Like
I mean,
that
it
scene
tries to get
showed.
on board with that. Like her brother is kind of gender new, something fluid. You don't even know what the brother's deal is, but she goes home to him and brings him like the bodies, and he's wearing like, I don't know, weird little boppy alien headbands and things, and it's kind of a bit sort of whatever, but they're just using that. It's just not fun. It's not a fun watch, and it tries to be, but I don't know. There's a series as well. If you want to inflict more pain on yourself, there's 2 seasons of this shit by now. So somebody must like it. There's some great like insults in that. I think the trailer for this series is on YouTube, and I watched that because I wasn't gonna watch any more of that. And she calls like the guy she's about to kill a sniveling defecator of a man or something, which I mean is a great insult. Like, am I use that? But there's words like cuntless throwing around. It's just very sexist and just very like unpalatable to me. Like, I didn't like that. And I like John Waters a lot. I like trashy stuff if it's done well, but this is just god awful. Like,
Well, I appreciate that you discussed the god awful as well as the.
yeah, I made myself watch that. Like,
Thank you so much
for the cause. It was a pleasure. I hope you had fun, everyone, and maybe I'll see you in Berlin sometime.
Absolutely, we'd love to have you at the festival here. And for those who don't know, we have a festival every February, the first weekend of February, in person and hopefully partially virtual as well in the future. It's in person in Berlin at City Kino Wedding. We also have an event coming up at the end of this month at Bachhaus in Weserstrasse, Bachhaus Projects. I'm like, is it English? Is it German? Who knows? But we have a best of program happening at the end of the month if you happen to be in Berlin. In 25 minutes, we'll be back here with a disability and horror panel. And then at 9 p.m., we'll have a talk on the monstrous feminine and political objections. So we hope to see you there. I posted the PayPal link as well in the chat if you'd like to donate. Thank you again, Katrin. Look forward to seeing you at the next talks.
For sure. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.